Hello, Tom Barnett here again with another story behind the illustration. Here, one that captures what I consider to be the most stunning realization of the book for me, namely that our world, so many centuries, even millennia, dominated by East-West dynamics, now heads into a decades-long era of North-South integration. Now, throughout the book, I make the argument that the primary drivers of North-South integration are climate change, demographic aging, the rise of a global majority middle class, all dynamics with huge North-South disparities that force such, as I describe it, vertical integration. Kind of using the world map on a wall as my image. So vertical integration, north-south integration, latitudinal integration, all meaning the same thing. But there's a larger, deeper story to be told about this shift, and I tell it here in this thread. It is the most essential sort of geopolitical reasoning, the notion that geography determines political evolution. I remember when Jared Diamond's 1997 book came out, Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies. Diamond addressed the question, since the end of the last ice age 12,000 years ago, why did some civilizations advance and develop so much faster than others, leading to the former conquering the latter and establishing competing world empires? In his analysis, the reason Eurasia had more advanced militaries, guns, stronger immune systems, germs, and better technologies, steel, that didn't come about because of differences in race, but really from differences in geography and environment. Where you lived determined whether you were a conqueror or the people who got conquered. Diamond's logic here was simple. The wider the continent, like the vast Eurasia, far wider than it was tall, the more environmental uniformity there was for civilizations to rise up and interact with one another and thus evolve faster. Europe's primary developmental advantage was thus its environmental sameness. Think of that huge band, 13,000 kilometers stretching from Ireland all the way over to Japan. Anything that thrived anywhere along that vast swath of territory, viruses, crops, animals, technologies, social advances, anything that arose and thrived anywhere along that vast swath could be transmitted and spread throughout the rest because the environment was basically the same. So adaptation not really required once you figured it out. In the tall and skinny parts of the world, like the Americas, that environmental sameness, it just didn't exist in that kind of breadth, because we're talking much thinner bands where civilizations largely stayed stuck in the mode of hunter-gatherers or subsistence agriculture. They just didn't develop in the same way that those competing Eurasian civilizations did. So when the age of discovery arrived and Europeans started exploring the world, the locals were no match for their militaries, for their diseases, or their manufacturing capacity. Being wider than taller was a huge advantage for Eurasia and a huge disadvantage for Africa and the New World of the Americas. This is why, for example, everyone in the Western Hemisphere speaks one or more of just 4 major languages: Spanish, English, Portuguese, French. That's an obvious legacy of colonialism. So our task here was to convey that collision of more advanced versus less advanced societies that began roughly a half millennium ago, somehow inserting this message of wide beats tall. Here's an early conceptual illustration from Sarah Nuttall, daughter and colleague of Throughline's senior graphic artist, Jim Nuttall. I get what she's going for here. One of those Spanish or Portuguese explorers hitting land somewhere in the Caribbean. So the apocryphal story of Christopher Columbus, for example. I like the ship imagery, and I got the local setting, but I just wasn't seeing enough of Jared Diamond's logic coming through. The first attempt, and I'm not sure here how much this one is Jim versus Sarah, that was submitted with the original manuscript was interesting. Clearly we have this conquistador type figure in some sort of dominance over the locals, who aren't terribly well defined here, but you get this sense of being defeated and or conquered, even subjected to slavery or forced labor. But this image was expecting a lot of foreknowledge from the reader, I thought, or worried, even as I had to admit that whether it was Jim or Sarah here, they did a very clever job of insinuating Diamond's famous map, the notion of a wide Eurasia conquering tall Latin America or Africa. Still, it felt like we had a long way to go to transmitting a fuller understanding of the thread's key concept here, that sense of uneven evolution leading to a huge advantage for the more advanced societies. Jim's second try got us a whole lot closer. One, you get this image of the world. It's clearly a European conquistador, and he's a huge figure relative to the Latin American locals. An unfair contest, really never in doubt. The locals are tall and skinny, but really closer to insects who can be squashed by this leviathan of a power rising out of Europe. I also like the indifference of the soldier's expression, as if this sort of conquering was his God-given right, a very common belief at the time. I have to admit, despite the disturbing implications of the illustration, I found it worked well. It was almost like the inverse of the Gulliver's Travels bit about a giant European man encountering these tiny natives in some distant locale, the Lilliputians. Except here, the giant was more than pleased to simply conquer and subject and crush the locals. Jim's second draft of that image, adopting a wider lens, allowed for Sarah's ship to re-enter the picture, which I liked, because that signifies, a certain advancement. Those were the most amazing vehicles of the age. The wider angle also gave us a more pronounced curvature of the Earth and kind of made it clearer what we were looking at here. An image kind of overlooking the South Atlantic. The red team version encountered no edits, as Jim just sharpened everything up. Which gets us to the final version where, in this instance, I'd like to point out Jim's signature / logo in the lower left corner, the J melding into the N. Jim Nuttall. In the end, I really like this illustration. The geography was clear. A reach from Europe across the South Atlantic with the Caribbean, South America, and West Africa in view, along with Europe itself. The historical timing is well established by the conquistador's military uniform. The sense of developmental disparity is embodied in the soldier's size relative to the locals and also the ship. And then there's that scary indifference on his face with regard to the sheer damage he's inflicting. Wide beats tall. A brutal calculation, but an accurate description. And that's the end of this story behind the illustration. As always, we love it when people buy the book, when they recommend the book, when they praise the book online. I and my Throughline colleagues, we feel very passionate about this work. Please consider subscribing to my Substack newsletter, and see you next time, next illustration.